All right. So we have finally arrived to our last theoretical class, which will center around concepts and ideas from multi-agent reinforcement learning. So clearly, this is a subject which is huge and would deserve a short course in itself. So we will only be able to touch briefly on some of the basic ideas and concepts, especially highlighting the connection between multi-agent reinforcement learning and game theory, and just briefly touching upon some algorithms which have a particularly interesting conceptual setting and meaning. All right, so what is multi-agent reinforcement learning? Multi-agent reinforcement learning is the problem of making decisions when there are several agents that interact with each other and with the environment. Okay, so if we have to describe graphically the setting of multi-agent reinforcement learning by using the usual description of the interface between agent and environment, we have to modify this a little bit. So in how do we modify that? Well, there always is the environment. But now we are in presence of several agents which interact with the environment. Okay, so this is agent 1, agent 2, agent, say, capital N. So each of these agents has in its own brain some procedure, like an algorithm by which it makes decisions which turn into actions. So there is an action for agent 1, an action for agent 2, and so on. All these actions feed into the environment. Okay, so they determine changes of the relative situation between the agents and the environment. In general, different agents might have different actions to play. Okay, so there is no restriction whatsoever about the symmetry of these agents. There are situations in which you might think that this is a crowd of agents which have the same abilities and the same capabilities, the same opportunities of doing certain sets of actions, but you might think also about situations where there's a lot of structures and some agents can do things that others can't. Okay. In response to these actions, or just because the environment evolves by itself, the environment returns feedbacks to each agent. Okay, so there are arrows which go back to each agent separately. These reactions in reinforcement learning typically are composed by rewards, which again are personalized as the action. So agent 1 gets a reward and an observation, and so on and so forth. These observations could be full states or could be just partial observations. Okay, there's no specification whatsoever. What is the goal of this global decision process? Well, the goal is usually partitioned in end goals. So each agent has its own agenda. So the goal, the goals are for each agent. So agent I wants to choose a policy that we will define in a second. So there is a strategy, a way to choose actions to maximize the expected cumulative reward, as usual, of the reward that this agent observes. Sorry, it's not correct. Over time. Okay, so there is now a set of I going from 1 to n objectives. And this depends in general also from the actions that the other agents are taking. Okay, so in this exchange also there is the fact that the action can be of other agents typically isn't observable itself. Okay, so just think about when you're playing chess. So what you observe is the state of the board, and you also observe the action that the agent is doing. Okay, so you combine this together, or in any other kind of game, when you just play a ball game, you will be observing simultaneously many things, including what the other players are doing. And each of these amounts to some reward that you receive and you want to optimize. In some situations, rewards might be collective. Okay, so there might be a notion of group reward. So for instance, if you play soccer, the actions that you're doing are not meant to optimize your own personal reward, but there's a reward which is common to the team. Okay, so all these kinds of variants can be cast qualitatively in this setting. Okay, so this is the graphical description of what multi-agent reinforcement learning looks like. But now, as we did for single-agent reinforcement learning, we have to turn this diagram into some specific mathematical formulation. So, and a common language to describe these kind of problems is what goes under the name of Markov Games. Okay, so we will spend a second here to describe formally what Markov Games are. All right, so let me get to the proper notation that I have here. All right. So Markov games, which are often called also stochastic games, are defined as follows. So there are states which belong to a set S, which may think as always as to being a discrete set. And these are the states of the environment as usual. And as you can easily imagine from the diagram that I drew a few seconds ago, there are actions. There is a set of actions, A1, AN, actions for each player, for each agent or player. Okay. So there are slightly different terminology between reinforcement learning and game theory, but I will switch between the two invariably. So I will speak sometimes of an agent, sometimes of a player. That's the same concept. Okay. Then there is a transition probability, which maps the new state of the environment from the previous one and all the actions taken by the agent. Okay, so it's a combination of the agents which makes the system, the state, evolve into a new state. And this is the what is called the model of the environment. And then there is a reward function, okay, where actually this has to be made in several copies. So there will be our, let's say, index I reward function, which depends on the previous state of the environment in general, on all the actions that have been taken, and on the previous state. These are the average rewards. And then in this, like I just said, the goal is to, so what is a policy? Of course, now in general, sort of policy is, let me see if that's defined properly somewhere. Yeah. In general, a policy, in general, is defined as a probability distribution for all the actions given the state. And the goal is to find so yeah, here I have to specify, of course. Sorry, this is not correct, what I said, just said. So policy, yeah, this is a general way of defining a policy, which is sort of the problem when you think that all actions can be taken together, but all agents in a coordinated way and simultaneously. But what we are more interested in is more specifically. So let me step back a second. So what happens in a more specific situation is that you want to find more often. You want to find a policy for agent I, which picks action AI, depending on the state of the environment. Okay, so in which this is the situation where agents make choices depending on the state of the system independently. Okay, so this is the situation which are sort of independent agents. And each agent is caring about maximizing the goal GI. Of course, here the situation is much more complex with respect to the single agent, because each agent it might be interested in its own goal and optimizing over its own policy, or there may be situations in which they coordinate to find a global policy. Okay, so this is one of the many facets of multi-agent reinforcement learning. You could have situations in which you have a centralized controller. So everything that happens is monitored by a superior entity, which then assigns actions to the various decision makers. But we will be mostly interested in and discussing the situations where each agent is facing the environment in an independent way. So the connections, the communication between agents happens across through the states, through observation of the states, and not through some certain level of coordination. So we will be interested in what is called decentralized approaches to multi-agent decision making. And we will also be interested in a situation where there is concurrent learning. Okay, so we'll be interested in the end to understand what happens if all the agents are trying to learn at the same time. So there's no agent who has been trained before and then the others sort of imitate the behavior. Okay, all these things that I'm saying, that I'm talking about, they make perfect sense in multi-agent reinforcement learning. So there are very many axes, very many directions in which multi-agent reinforcement learning can be declined, and I will refer to reviews and overviews on this subject for more on that. But here we will be specifically focusing on the situation which is I think, the most interesting one, the most challenging one, in which agents have control only on their own decisions, and they have to learn independently from each other how to perform optimally. Okay, and this is probably the most challenging problem in reinforcement, multi-agent reinforcement learning. But that's my point of view. Okay, so now that we have defined formally this problem, just as we saw in for single agent reinforcement learning, this problem can be tackled in different ways depending on what kind of knowledge you have about the system. And in particular, we will be considering just two situations. So the first situation is when the model is known. So when the model is known, this is once more a planning problem. Okay, so everything is known, what the future decision would be. So you would be not surprised to hear that in this case, you can use dynamic programming. So there are techniques like value iteration that you can apply also to this multi-agent setting. Of course, this requires a lot of knowledge because you have to know what happens every time that all the agents take the actions simultaneously, and what happens to the environment when they take these actions. And if you remember, a big problem of applying dynamic programming in single agent reinforcement learning was the fact that state action spaces are large. And now the problem is even worse if you have many agents, because so think about just a very simple problem in which there is no state and each agent can take just two actions. Okay? So this is the simplest problem is basically a two-armed bandit in the single agent situation. But now suppose that you have 10 agents which are playing this game. Each agent can make two actions, either 0 or 1, let's say, or A or M or B. But now the state of possible actions that they can take is 2 to the power 10. So very quickly, you are handling very large action spaces, even in the simplest problems. So the presence of many agents exponentiates the size of the state action space, typically, maybe the state not, but the action states for sure. And therefore, if there was a curse of dimensionality for the single agent, this curse is even worse when you have to face many agents. So apart from the very simple situations, which basically boil down to usual matrix game theory, dynamic programming is not a viable option. So this as well, just what I said, the curse of dimensionality. So, and then one could ask about what happens when we have model-free reinforcement learning in the multi-agent case. So here the situation is actually very rich. And one class of algorithms that sort of tries to expand upon the setting of single agent reinforcement learning are sort of Q-learning like algorithms. So the general shape of this Q-learning like algorithms is goes as follows. I'll take the So the general pattern is the following. So the policy. So as in Q-learning or SARSA, the class of this class of algorithm, the policy for agent I is somehow derived by some decision making, which can abstractly written as an operation which say solve as a function of your Q values. So you can define Q values in this multi-agent reinforcement learning problem as well, right? So these are the expectation values of your future returns conditioned on the state and the current action that you're taking. And therefore, there is a way of extracting a policy starting from a Q value. Okay, this is what you would do for single agent reinforcement learning, for instance, by trivially using epsilon greedy or this kind of strategies. Okay, or it could be just the argmax if you are using dynamic programming. It's a sort of an operation more than an actual specific algorithm. And then you have the operation by which you update the Q, your Q, for the agent I. You update it in the usual way. That is, you correct for the error, and the temporal difference error in this case is just the reward that this agent I has picked at time t plus 1. Then there is a plus gamma, and here there is something which, for instance, for Q learning would be take the maximum of the possible actions at the new state as prime. But now we replace it with another generic operator, which is called eval for I, of the Q matrices at the state as prime, or st plus 1 if you want to use that notation. So probably we just didn't use this. So let's see. That's the notation we use here. Q state, and then this is where all the actions stay, minus Q of S, and all the set of current actions. Okay, so and then there is a closed parenthesis. So you see that there is the same formal structure as in Q learning or in SARSA. But the key issue here is what you use as these two functions, solve and eval. So suppose you have all the Q values of your actors. So this operation solve is non-trivial, for instance, because, like I discussed earlier, you could decide that the policy of the agent I depends only on the Q of its own goal. But for instance, if the agent is able to observe the Q functions of other agents, because they can communicate between them, suppose that they are robots, they can send signals to each other and say, my Q value matrix is this one. So if it has this additional information, it might decide strategically to consider that. So for instance, if these are two competing agents and one agent has access to the Q matrix of the other agent, the first agent could strategically think, okay, I suppose that now you're going to play that action. So I'm going to play another action in order to reply to your anticipated decision. Okay, you see how complicated it gets very quickly. But in the simplest case, this could be just epsilon greedy of its own Q matrix, just to fix the ideas. And this is the first layer of complexity. And then the second layer of complexity comes from this eval function, which has to pick the contribution from the other agents. And in order to highlight how complicated this could be, you must think that the choice of this function reflects what your expectations are about what the other agents are doing. Okay, so for instance, if you're playing a game in which every time that you play, if you gain something, your opponent loses the same amount, or vice versa, this is what is called a minimax. This is what is called a zero-sum game. Okay, and we will see an example shortly. And in these situations, for instance, this eval operator is not the maximum over the Q matrix of your opponent, but it's the minimum. Okay, so it changes completely the sign, because this is what corresponds in game theory to a minimax strategy. Okay, so I understand that not everything could be crystal clear, but the point here is to say that when you play games, this operation of knowing what happens at the next step depends crucially on the structure of the game. And therefore, the straightforward extension of Q learning just by taking maxima does not work in general. But you have to pay particular attention to what this algorithms can do. So there will be a lot more to say about this class of algorithms, but we will just skip over that, because I would like to spend more time in discussing a simpler case, which we will move to shortly. What I want to add also is that, of course, as you can use actor critic only algorithms like this generalization of Q learning, you can also use actor critic algorithms, which, as we discussed yesterday, combine the operation of gradient ascent in the space of policies with the operation of temporal difference learning in order to estimate the temporal difference error. So over the last year, there's been a proliferation of these possibilities of algorithms. Since I would say last 3 years, there's been really a wealth of algorithms which heavily use function approximation with deep networks to produce algorithms that solve complex multi-agent situations, especially video games, but also board games. And it's very difficult to take a snapshot of the current situation because it's evolving by the day. But definitely, this is a field which has been blooming over the last few years. But since here we want just to fix the ideas on some very basic concept, I would like to spend the remaining time of this first half of the lecture by discussing a very simple situation. And this situation is what happens when you have the so-called matrix games. So what are matrix games? In a sense, these are the equivalent of the bandit problem for multi-agent systems. Okay, so matrix games exist by themselves since a long time in the literature of game theory. So we will sort of introduce very quickly the notion of what is a matrix game, but we will quickly depart from the mainstream of game theory, because the goal for us would be to find algorithms that are able to play any game in the situation where they don't know what the game is. Okay, so the goal of multi-agent reinforcement learning model free in matrix games is to provide algorithms that can play well to no matter what structure of the game you have. Okay, I hope I'll be more clear in a second. But let's start with a couple of examples to fix the ideas. So first example, very simple. This is what you might be familiar with as a the problem of odd-even game. Okay, so there are two players, and each player can show a number from 0 to 6, just like this. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are 3 possibilities of getting an even number and 3 possibilities of getting an odd number. And the other player simultaneously does the same thing. Okay. And who wins? Well, beforehand, the player decides, I play odd. So if the sum of the numbers that we throw down is odd, I win. And the opponent loses, or vice versa. Okay, so it's a very simple game that you might have played in order to decide who gets to choose the first slice of the cake between you and your brother, maybe, or sister. Okay, so it's a very simple game. And how do we formalize this game? Well, we formalize it through a notion which is known as a payoff matrix. In this payoff matrices, we list in the rows and in the columns. So this could be player 1. So maybe this is player 1. I always forget what's the convention, but doesn't really matter. So player 1 and player 2. So clearly each player has just 2 options. Okay, so let's say that player 1 wins when sum is even. Okay, and the other player wins when the sum is odd. So this matrix, in each entry of this matrix, there is the reward, so the gain, the payoff that each player gets when they are playing these 2 actions. So let's say the player 1 plays even or odd, even or odd. So what does it mean? Player 1 plays even. It means that he chooses either 0, 2, or 4. Clearly, from the viewpoint of the outcome, these 3 actions are totally indifferent, right? We could write a bigger matrix 6 by 6, but that would make no difference. So let's restrict just to the fact that they play either odd or even. So then there are 2 payoff matrices. So one gives what the reward of the first agent is if they play 2 actions simultaneously, and the other one gives what the other player 2 receives. Usually these 2 matrices are combined into the same graphical object by splitting each cell into 2 parts, in which the upper part gives the payoff for player 2, and the lower part gives the payoff for player 1. So more formally, there are 2 payoff matrices which corresponds to 2 entries, where A1 is the action that player 1 plays, and A2 is the action that player 2 plays. And for the combination of the 2, we get an average reward R1. In this case, in the case that I just described you, there's no randomness unless you're very bad at making additions. Okay, because once you play 4 and the other one plays 2, the outcome is 6. It's not never 5 or 7 or whatever, right? So there's no randomness in the outcomes in this specific case, but in the following, you will be interested in the situations where this randomness might emerge. Okay, so in this setting, in practice, for every action, so suppose that in general you have a matrix like this. In this case, it would be 4 actions and 4 actions, but it could be non-square. So maybe one agent has 3 actions and the other one has 7 actions, doesn't matter. Still, it's valid matrix game. If you have action 1 here and action 2 here, so in this particular square here, this lower part is occupied by R1, A1, A2, and this one is occupied by R2, A1, A2. Okay, so this is a way of graphically representing the 2 payoff matrices at the same time on this table. So let's go back to our system. So what happens to player 1 when both players play even? Well, even plus even is even. So player 1 wins, player 2 loses. What if one plays even and the other plays odd? Well, in this case, player 1 loses and player 2 wins. And here we fall back to this because odd plus odd is even. All right. So this is how you describe this simple game in terms of payoff matrices. And this is what is called a zero-sum game. Because every win for one agent is a loss exactly of the same amount, apart from overall constants. Okay. So this is an example. So what traditional game theory cares about is to find playing strategies for this game. And of course, there's a variety of ways by which this game could be played. So, but I specifically said one important thing is that both players play simultaneously. So in a Markov game, the policy, so there here you see that there is no state. What would be a state in this particular problem? It would be the fact that this matrix is changing depending on the state of the environment. Okay, so the game is changing under your hands, but this is not what's happening here. So that's why in this case, this is the equivalent of a bandit problem, because there's just one state, one payoff matrix, and the rewards depend only on the actions. And in a Markov setting, this means that you choose policies just based on actions. So there's a variety of techniques to study this problems in game theory, which include repeated games, etc. So we will not touch upon that at all, because we will just focus on the specifics of this approach through Markov Games and to see what this gives in terms of reinforcement learning. Okay, so this is one example. There are other examples which are structurally very different. For instance, one of such games is called Prisoner's Dilemma, which is another game in which there are two agents which have two actions. Okay, so it's the same kind of 2x2 game. So the way that you describe this game is the following. Suppose that there are two criminals who have been arrested, and so they have to be trialed. And before the trial, they have two options. If they, let me use the proper notation for this. Yeah. So either they stay silent, so they don't say anything when they are asked questions about what happened. So suppose that they did a robbery at the bank. These two have been separately have been arrested and then are took separately into two different rooms, and they are questioned. So they have two possibilities. Either they stay silent, they don't tell anything about what's happened, they just deny everything. And if this happens, they will get convicted. but they will be sentenced, let's say, to 1 year of prison. Okay, so this is the situation where they stay silent. And each of those gets 1 year. So the reward here is minus 1 year of jail for both of them. But they could also betray. Okay, so they, for instance, could say, "Oh, it wasn't me. I was just been involved marginally, but he is the person who did everything, and I can give you this information and that to find, for instance, where all the money that we stole is hidden." Okay. So in this case, if player 2 betrays, it goes free. Okay, and the other one gets 3 years of jail. And clearly the situation is symmetrical in this case. And if both betray each other, okay, both of them get 2 years in prison. Because the value of the betrayal is considered to be less if both of them, let's take the game as it is. Okay, you can argue that this makes sense. But there are other ways of writing these games, of course. As a matter of fact, as a side remark, all these kinds of 2x2 games, which are called symmetrical, because you see that this is not a zero-sum game, because there is no this plus minus symmetry, but still is a symmetric game, in the sense that the matrix of payoffs for agent 1 is equal to the matrix of payoff of agent 2 transposed. So if we exchange the rows and the columns, we get the same thing. Symmetric means that basically the identities of the players don't matter in this kind of games. There are also games which are asymmetric and are more complex. So you see that there's a huge variety. But this kind of games which are symmetric and have just 2 actions, you can easily imagine that they can be classified. So you can put numbers in these slots, and and you have classes of games, which, for instance, other games like these are hawk and dove, etc. So what is interesting in this particular situation is that basically this is a choice between cooperating or defecting. Okay. So this is also a template for many situations in decision making for humans and for animals, where you have to choose about cooperating to have some sort of good reward, but less than what you would have if you betray. But if you betray, clearly there is a temptation also for the other player to betray as well, and this gets you to a situation which is worse. So if you look at this table here, you see clearly that there is a difficult situation in decision making, because if you decide to cooperate, well, you get away with -1. So there is a better option, that is to betray. But if you betray, the other agent will also be tempted to betray. So you will fall into the situation where both of you get 2 years of jail. Okay, so this is just to highlight in a very simple game like this what kind of complex situations may arise as a result of the fact that the outcome is the combined decision of 2 agents. And then maybe if they don't communicate, as in this case, it's very difficult to know how to coordinate, what to do. Okay. Fine. So how do we formalize this kind of problem? Well, it's very simple, because we know basically how to write our objective functions, our goals. So the goal for agent 1 is expressed in terms of the sum over all the actions taken by agent 1 and actions taken of agent 2, the payoff matrix for agent 1 times the policy adopted by agent 1 times the policy adopted by agent 2. So you see, the fact that the policies appear in form of a product means that the actions are taken independently. So they cannot talk to each other and decide, okay, let's decide together what to do. Okay. In that case, they would find a different solution, possibly, in general. But here we focus in this case where these two are deciding independently and trying to find out the best solution. And this is what happens also for agent 2. Yeah. But it sees a different payoff matrix. So like I said earlier, these kind of problems can be attacked via dynamic programming. That is, you write down Bellman's optimality equations, which look like mostly like the single agent one, or you can attack them via Q-learning. But here we will be interested in one specific class of algorithms, which is particularly interesting. And we would like to see what happens when we apply natural policy gradient for matrix games. So we will discuss this in two steps. So the first step would be a situation in which you know the payoff matrix. Okay, so it's not the model-free situation. It's a situation just because we want to understand what is happening with this kind of algorithms. So we explicitly say, I give you the matrix. If I give you the matrix, you could solve this problem by other means. Okay, there are many ways of solving this decision problem. I don't discuss them. I just focus on the specific case where we pick off the shelf of our possible approaches. We want to do natural policy gradient ascent. Okay, so this will also allow us to review a little bit what natural policy gradient does. So what is the idea? The idea is the following. Parameterize the policies. So we will have a set of parameters theta 1, which is a vector of parameters for the policy 1, and a corresponding set of parameters theta 2 for the policy 2. This is the first step for doing policy gradient. You have to have a parameterized policy, and you want to seek this in the space of parameters. In this particular case, we will choose specifically, we choose this works in general for a fixed number of actions, the same for both agents. So for any square matrix game, need not be 2, but of course applies also to 2. We will parameterize this as follows. So the policy for agent I, where I goes from 1 to 2. So I'm not discussing situations where there could be more than 2 agents, but they exist. So you could have games in which 3 agents play simultaneously, and the payoff matrix depends on what they do. Okay, but these are not particularly common. So we limit ourselves to 2 agents which are playing the game. So specifically, we will set this kind of parameterization. So for agent I, there will be a set of parameters theta I. So maybe the best way to write this would be to put these i's. Sorry, the notation is a bit cumbersome because there's a lot of indices, but I hope you will be patient enough to follow. So for agent I, there is this set of parameters theta I. So theta I is a vector, so they belong to R to some dimension. Okay. We want to express this in the following way. So the probability of taking action A I, because this is the action taken by agent I, so I repeat all this I for the agent many times, is exponential of theta okay, this is getting weird, so let me just use without an index here. So theta A divided by some normalization factor, which is exponential of theta I B. So this is a way of parameterizing my policy, and this is normalized over B. So I have parameters for my agent I. He has parameters theta 1, theta I, k, where k is the number of actions. So in our situation, there will be just two agents, two parameters, because there are two actions. Okay. So let me be even more explicit. For k equals 2 actions, which is the square game that I had here, for this kind of games, I would have theta for agent 1, parameter 1, theta for agent 2, parameter 2. These together give me the policy for agent 1, that it takes action A, which also goes from 1 to 2, is exponential of theta 1A divided by exponential. So let's even make it even more explicit. The probability of taking action 1 with this. The probability that agent 1 takes action 2 is going to be exponential of theta 2. Pair of parameters 1 So in this case, you have 4 parameters, 2 for the first agent, 2 for the second agent, and these 2 parameters give you the probabilities of taking action 1 and action 2. It's a bit of a mess, I realize, okay? But this is just to tell you that there is a systematic way of parameterizing policies, which are, without much of a fantasy, called exponential or Boltzmann parameterization, and is the kind of parameterization that we will use. So what is the area of natural policy gradient? That the parameters of each agent should move according to the gradient with respect to this set of parameters of my objective function. So this objective function here, which is for each agent, depends on the parameters of agent 1 and agent 2. And at each time step, I want to move these parameters in the direction that makes each of the agents better. So each agent wants to optimize over its own parameters in order to improve its own policy. And we want to know where this algorithm, which tries to do gradient ascent separately on these 2 sets of parameters, where will it bring us? So what is the behavior of this algorithm? Okay. So there's a learning rate here. So in particular, what we want to do in this case is that we would like to use the natural gradient. So the reason why we want to use the natural gradient will be clear, I hope, soon. But just to recall you what the natural gradient is, the ordinary gradient ascent of descent is the result of a compromise between going down the gradient and penalizing steps that are too long in the L2 norm, so in the Euclidean norm. Natural gradient is an operation that you do in the space of probability distributions, because these are parameters of probability distributions, which are the policies, in which you compromise between going down the gradient, in this case going up the gradient, because you want to maximize your gain, and penalizing steps that are too far in terms of a distance, which is the Kullback-Leibler divergence between before and after. And if you work out the calculations that were present in the paper that I shared with you yesterday, you realize that if you take small steps, this amounts to deforming the ordinary gradient, the vanilla gradient, by means of a matrix which is the inverse of the Fisher information matrix, which is related to the notion of distances between probability distributions when they are close enough. Okay? So, what does it mean in our case? Well, we have to take the gradient, the natural gradient, with respect to these parameters theta I, for instance, with index A of GI. And what is that explicitly? Well, that is just theta A, and then we have sum over A1, A2, or I. So these are just two actions, okay? A1, A2, times pi 1, A1, pi 2, A2. Okay, so I'm just replacing this previous notion of what the objective is. Now, clearly, if I take the derivative, so let's fix ourselves on agent 1. So we want to optimize for agent 1. And this clearly, this object here, this derivative acts only on this policy. Okay, this makes sense. I can only optimize what I do. I cannot optimize what the parameters of my opponent are. I'm trying to do my best independently of what the other agent does. Of course, it's not, the outcome is not independent of what the other agent does, but my attempt at optimizing depends only on what I can control. And my control is limited to my own policy. So this operation just leads to the gradient of the sum is the sum of the gradients. So this is R1, A1, A2. Pi 2 is left unchanged, but I have the gradient, the natural gradient of theta A1, pi 1, A1. Now, the algebraic fact that I'm not going to prove because it's boring and a bit cumbersome is that this object here, this natural gradient here, is actually equal to 1 if the action is exactly the one labeled by the parameter A and 0 otherwise. So this is something that holds only if you take the natural gradient and the exponential combination of parameters. Looks like a little bit of a miracle, but it requires a little bit of calculations. You have to compute what the Fisher matrix is. Nothing very, very complex. You can do calculation explicitly. For instance, you just have two actions. That's something which is very straightforward, if annoying. Or you can use a symbolic calculator and you will find out that this is the result. Which has an interesting consequence, because this simplifies the expression for the gradient here, which removes the sum over A1 and just says that this is just A2 R1 A A2. So what does this mean in practice? It means that this parameter theta for my policy, which corresponds to the action that I am taking, will change exactly according to the expected payoff that I get while playing. So this is exactly the expected payoff when playing A by agent 1. And the same happens if you reverse sides. Okay, that's the same kind of expression that you find. Why is this result interesting? Because when you look at what happens, so this is the, remember, this is the update for the parameters. But now let's look at what happens for the policies themselves. So after one step of natural policy gradient, my new policy for agent 1, okay, now I'm dropping as many indices as possible. My new policy will be the previous policy plus alpha times the previous policy. And now here I get a term which is, let me write it properly, so let's say this is the probability of taking action A, and this would be like the sum over actions B taken by the other agent of the reward matrix for agent 1, action AB times by B2 minus the sum over B and C. So calculations aside, the important conceptual thing is that these equations maybe they don't tell you anything to you, but they have a name in game theory, and they are called replicator equations. And these equations are the basis to describe what is called evolutionary game theory. So again, boring, cumbersome calculations, but the bottom line of all this is that natural policy gradients, not the stochastic ones, just the full NPG, corresponds to evolutionary game theory. And this evolutionary game theory is a subject which is enormous. There are entire books over this subject. So the take-home message here is that this class of algorithms that we discussed, which are essentially reinforced algorithm, actor-only algorithms with the notion of a distance which is coming from the Kullback-Leibler divergence, that is, with natural gradients, correspond to well-known domain in evolutionary game theory. And therefore, they inherit all the results that we have from evolutionary game theory. Where does this system go? What is the policy that is reached by the system? Is it a Nash equilibrium? Is it not? What are evolutionary stable states? Okay, all this kind of terminology then merges. So the point that I want to make here is, besides the calculation, is that this is a very interesting point, because you see that one subject, which is multi-agent reinforcement learning, makes contact with another big subject, which is evolutionary game theory, which in itself makes contact with other domains of machine learning, like evolutionary genetic algorithms. So I don't expect you to sort of grasp all the details of this, but just to keep in mind that these very different concepts actually have boundary domains that overlap with each other. Okay. And before we take a well-deserved break, and then the second part, I promise, will be funnier. The last thing, this was done in the model-based. So what about the model-free case? Well, suffice it to say, without any formula whatsoever, is that in this particular case, you can write down approximate gradients with respect to your parameters for any player. Very much in the same way that we did yesterday for the single player. And therefore, you can write down model-free algorithms that do stochastic gradient ascent. And what is the upshot of this is that these algorithms are valid for any game. You don't need to know the structure of the game. You will play the same algorithm, whether it's your matching pennies or odd even game, or whether it's a prisoner's dilemma. And they will have all the same theoretical guarantees which are connected to evolutionary game theory. So in the forest of all possible algorithms by which you can address a problem in game theory, in multi-agent reinforcement learning, there is one subclass which has provable connections with well-known domains. And so they represent a good starting point. Of course, all interesting problems are not that simple as matrix games. So there is a much more richness in the problems that we want to address. And after the break, I will give you some fun example of the things that you can do with this kind of class of algorithms on real multi-agent reinforcement learning problems. Okay? At least if you survive. Any questions? Okay. Then let's take a 10 minutes break and we reconvene at 25. See you later. All right, welcome back for the second part. And for that part, we will not have written notes, but I'll share window with you, which you should be able to see. So this part I will discuss a work which is rather recent by a group at OpenAI. An interesting idea that underlies the approaches to multi-agent reinforcement learning is that there is this intriguing suggestion that the ability of evolving complex abilities, like using tools, is essentially something that is fostered by acting in a social environment, that is in the multi-agent setting. And in particular, there is a influential group of researchers, especially at Google DeepMind, that thinks that the key to artificial general intelligence, so an intelligence which is not only able to solve specific tasks, but being able to solve a variety of tasks, sort of in a sense, imitating closer the capabilities of human intelligence and the intelligence of higher primates, actually stems from the multi-agent setting. Okay, so the multi-agent learning could be the key to developing artificial general intelligences. So we will go in detail through this, not the paper, but the blog entry by OpenAI, and we will see the kind of things that they do, and we will also have a quick glimpse at what kind of algorithms are employed to do that. So here the situation is defined quite in quite simple way. This is a hide and seek game. So there are red players, which are seekers, and hiders, which are blue. And of course, the seekers want to catch the hiders. So what are the states and the actions for this system? So the states are defined by this complex environment, which is made of rooms, of blocks, of ramps. You will see a lot of stuff move around. Some of these items can be displaced, as you can see. The agents are 4 agents. Typically here, they could be more, or even less if there's just one searcher and 2 hiders. They can move around, and the way that they move around is that they use an implementation of physics, right? So in the sense that they really exert a force on the ground, and this force led them to move in one direction or the other. They can steer, they can move around. Okay, so there's a whole set of actions which has to do with the moving, which is, if you wish, sort of improved version of grid world. Okay, but much better, of course. Then there are percepts. So the percepts are that they can see objects in their line of view. So you can see that in this central snippet. So they see what there's around in a certain view angle in front of them. They can also sense the distance to objects. So they have another information, not only what they view, but they also feel objects that they are in their way. So pretty reasonable stuff. They can grab objects and move them around, and then it can also lock them. Okay, so you see they can put a lock, and this cannot be moved any longer. So there is a certain repertoire of possibilities that they have, and the goal here is to deploy an algorithm for multi-agent reinforcement learning, which, broadly speaking, is in the class of natural policy gradients, but actor-critic form, because there are states here, of course, and see what happens, and see what they learn to do starting from a blank slate. All right, so in this case, we are a little bit doing some sort of behavioral psychology of algorithms, in the sense that we see things happen and we try to see what happens and understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. The only rewards that are given are team-based. So team hiders and team seekers get a reward if they catch the hider or if they escape the seeker, respectively. Okay, so it's a zero-sum game, which is what is written in this paragraph here. All right. Let's see what happens. Okay, So at the beginning, actions start out randomly, and you see that these agents are doing whatever. Okay, so they're bumping around objects, they are trying to locate, so the seekers here are trying to locate the hiders, but they do that at random, so they sort of try to grab them, but independently of the distance where they are, so it's a mess. Then after quite a while, okay, so I attract your attention to the number of episodes, which is already 2.69 millions. Okay, so this is not something that you run on your laptop, for sure. So it's conceptually simple stuff, but computationally quite hard. Nevertheless, let's see what happens. After this phase, eventually the seekers learn to chase the hiders. Okay, so they have learned that the kind of actions that they have to do is to direct themselves towards the position where the hiders were starting. Okay, so there are all sorts of details here to make the game non-trivial, in the sense that, for instance, the hiders are given 5 seconds grace period before the seekers start to look for them. Okay, so they can hide, and then you see, okay, so all these kind of things are relevant details, because if you don't put them, you might end up in having trivial solutions. But nevertheless, once you fix them, this is what you observe. Okay, so first they start learning. So you see here on this diagram on the left, as a function of the number of games played, basically red means that in this phase, the payoff for the chasers, for the seekers, is relatively higher with respect to the hiders. But then, as time goes by, hiders learn their counter strategy, and they learn to pull the blocks and keep the seekers out. Okay, you see, during the time that the hiders, the red ones, stay frozen in place, they quickly learn to block the entrance, and therefore, in this case, it's them who get the best. And this is the situation where they have learned this dot blocking ability. And then here, the reward falls dramatically for the hiders, for the seekers, and grows for the hiders. Then seekers learn that if they grab a ramp, they can climb over the ramp and overcome the wall. In this case, everything goes back again. The balance is shifted again in favor of the seekers. All of this is pure reinforcement learning, model-free, unsupervised. Okay, there are a lot of technicalities in how the algorithm is implemented and the neural networks that you use, etc. So it's just like running a very powerful car, but the key ingredients, the steering, the engine, are conceptually the same. Okay, so what else? Well, let's take out the ramp first. Okay, so here the hiders learn to take out the ramp and then block the doors. And you see, this requires a lot of coordination, because one of the agents has to decide to go outside, and while the other one already pulls the blocks close. Otherwise, they don't make it in time. Okay, so this tends to work. You see that here the balance between blue and red is not entirely on the side of the hiders, which means that they don't do this deterministically. Okay, sometimes, depending on where the blocks are, maybe they are not fast enough, they bump into corners. Okay, so you don't have to have the impression that everything here is just phases in which they learn completely, but they sort of learn to do it with certain relatively high probability. And we are already in the range of tens of millions of episodes. Okay, fine. Okay, this is what I said earlier, that they coordinate. So while one gets the ramp, the other one fixes the blocks so they can speed up the thing. Okay, now at this point, they move to a more complex environment, a richer environment, which has lots of stuff in it. So there are moving blocks, the The walls now are not entirely separating a room from the other space, but they can move around more stuff, etc. Okay, so there are ramps, there are blocks, there are all sorts of things. At the beginning, as usual, we start again from 0 and they do stuff at random. After several millions episodes, then again, the seekers learn to chase the hiders, and that's what they are doing here. And now the hiders learn to build up a shelter, okay, from the pieces that they have. So since there is not a room, well, let's make one. And quick enough. All right. Then again, they learn, the chasers learn to use a ramp to get inside. And you see that when they get inside, the hiders already realize that they are getting close, and then they escape, try to escape, but that's not to no avail. Here there are 3 seekers and 2 hiders, okay? So you see that the setting has changed in terms of players. Now, again, same game. Now, the first thing that they do, you see the agent here on the left. You played that again. It goes to the ramp and locks it. And then they make the shelter. So when the agents start, they cannot use the ramp to jump in as before. Okay, so they sort of neutralize that strategy. And now interesting things start to happen, because the physics that you can implement on such a computer is one physics. And as a matter of fact, there was a little bug in the implementation in that the friction of the boxes against the bottom was 0. So the agents learned that if they climb on a box and start walking, then the force is transmitted to the box and they can surf the box. This is a glitch, okay? This is a glitch in the implementation of physics in this algorithm. And they, after hundreds of millions of episodes, have actually discovered this glitch that the programmers were unaware of, in order to exploit it, to use the boxes as ramps, since the ramps were blocked. Okay. Then, finally, the hiders learned that they have to lock everything, including the boxes, and then, of course, fine. Okay. But you see that this solution has come after several rounds of competition. And the idea is that these solutions without this competition would not have emerged. So in the process of doing this, which I will just give you an idea of the complexity of the algorithm they use. So it's a policy gradient class algorithm, but the way it works is quite complex in the sense that there are lots of neural networks which pick separately different information and then put them together. Then they process it once more. They use recurrent network at one stage to produce eventually actions. Okay, so this is a parameterization of a policy in the sense that it maps states into actions. But what happens here inside, you don't want to know. Okay, so this is a typical situation when your car brakes and you open and you look into close to the motor, you don't have any idea whatsoever what is happening. Okay, so this is certainly not a transparent and explainable setting, but it's a very powerful one in this case. So there are merits and demerits in this kind of architecture. Certainly, without harnessing the power of deep neural networks, such complex algorithms probably wouldn't work. But at the same time, there's a lot of work to do in understanding why all these things are important, what do they do in practice, and why the learning is effective in such a complex environment. So here you see that there is one word that we didn't employ, proximal policy optimization. What is it? Well, proximal policy optimization is essentially as natural policy gradient, only that rather than balancing the tendency to go up the gradient and a cost for the distance you travel, in proximal policy optimization, you just say, I don't want to go further than a certain Kullback-Leibler divergence, okay? So it's a harder way of imposing that your steps should not be larger than a certain amount. But other than that, which of course requires a different implementation, it's exactly in the same class of algorithms, same principles, same ideas. All right, so then technical stuff. Okay, I will skip that because that's technical, because I want to go to the final part, is that like I showed you earlier, there was this box surfing strategy that they learned, but they learned also other strategies that were very interesting, and that they were allowed by the implementation of the algorithm, but were not intentionally included by the programmers. So one of that is that, which is rather obvious, is that if you don't put outside boundary, then the hiders learn the strategy that they have to go away, and they also carry a block with them, because if they happen to be in some corner, they can also still use the block. Okay, so they have a double strategy in this case. One thing that they also discovered is that other than blocking the ramp, if they walk on the ramp and make it surf and they send it onto a corner, there was another glitch in the physics of the corner, so they were able to expel the ramp from the domain. And then they also discovered another thing, is that if they go at full speed on the corner, on the wall, hitting with the corner of the ramp, then the ramp falls outside of the domain and they can jump into the, okay? So the first time I saw this, I said, that's unreal, okay? But I had the chance to speak with one of the authors, and so he promised that they have been seeing this. Okay. So this is just sort of a very, very nice example of the kind of things that you can actually do with multi-agent reinforcement learning. Clearly, this kind of applications require an enormous computational power, but they definitely are at the forefront of research nowadays in reinforcement learning. So the purpose of this course was that at the end, now you should be in a position of looking into one of these blog items and being able to understand qualitatively at least what they do, and to some extent also quantitatively. And for those of you who think that reinforcement learning is an interesting avenue for future research, which is a viewpoint that of course I share, then you should have the tool to start embarking in projects that involve reinforcement learning on a rather wide spectrum of applications, ranging from robotics to computer science and computer games. Okay, so before we close, there are many things that we could not even touch upon. Okay, so many things we have been treating superficially, too superficially, because of lack of time, and many things we really didn't touch upon at all, which include, for instance, risk-sensitive decision-making. Okay, this is one example that we didn't speak about at all, but it's very important. What is risk-sensitive decision-making? So let's imagine that we have two options. Okay, so first option that I offer you is that I give you 100 euros, no questions asked. And the second option is we draw a random number from 1 to 100. Okay, you decide beforehand what number you want to bet on. And if that number comes out, I give you 10,000 euros. So on average, these two things are equivalent. So no matter what algorithm we used, of all the algorithms that we've been speaking so far, the goal of this is exactly the same in its very simple setting. But what would you choose? It depends. Some of you would say, okay, I will set for the 100 euros. Okay. This is what is called a risk-averse strategy, because you are putting a bonus for certainty on top of the average. But maybe some of you feels lucky, or says, I don't know, maybe I just borrowed or I lost 9,000 euros yesterday playing net poker, so 100 euros don't make anything for me. But if I hit the 10,000, I'm free from the people who want to break my legs. Okay, so maybe in that case you would go for the risk. You would be risk seeking, and you would choose the second one. So is it possible to formulate these problems of decision making by accounting for risk? Of course, this is something which is also important in economics and finance. Okay, because we know that many human decisions are sensitive to risk. The bottom line is that there is some attempt in that direction. Some results are clean, some others are less clean. It's a field that is comparatively underdeveloped with respect to the usual objective of optimizing averages, but it's very important nevertheless. Fine, this is one thing that we didn't talk about, but definitely is an important subject. Other things that we didn't touch upon. There is a word about what is called a reward shaping. Okay, so when you design a reinforcement learning problem, the way you shape rewards is essential. So there is the task that you want to realize. Suppose you want to design a problem of finding the shortest path, and you want to approach it in a model-free way. So finding the shortest path between point A to point B, you could realize this with many, many structures of rewards. For instance, you just give a reward when the agent reaches the target, or you put a penalty for every step that the agent makes away from the target. Now, it turns out that when you use learning algorithms, these two settings, which give exactly the same result, the same optimal policy, in the first case, the learning is much slower. Why is that? Because the rewards are sparse. It takes a lot before getting some feedback from the environment. And if the domain is very large at the beginning and you act randomly, you will be going around without knowing whatsoever, without ever improving your Q matrix or your policy, because you don't get any feedback. So designing rewards in a meaningful way is very important. And there is a lot of research activity in what does it mean to construct meaningful shapes for rewards that preserve your optimal policy. So this is a list of open questions that still lay around in reinforcement learning, how to construct these things properly. This is very important, especially when you have very long-term goals, okay? But this is something which is also very understandable from the viewpoint of psychology. So when you want to reach a long-term goal, so suppose I want to lift 70 kilograms at the bench, okay? Then what you do is you set yourself with a series of intermediate tasks, okay? You don't start with that immediately. You say, oh, I always start using the dumbbells, and then I will start exercising with this, and then eventually, maybe in 7 months, I will be able to push 70 kilograms at the bench, okay? So this fact that you design your own incentives and you design your own intermediate objectives in order to reach a final reward is something which people now is trying to automatize, to make machine learning that is able to shape rewards, to design objectives. And then while you design your objective, you also try to optimize your decisions toward those objectives. Okay. And then there is a an infinite list of many, many interesting subjects in reinforcement learning, but we are not even able to mention them all. So we have to close here for what the theoretical classes are. We will have 2 tutorials, one tomorrow, and this will be on only in actor critic algorithms. So we will see this kind of algorithms that I was talking about in practice in I think in the cart poll example. And then next week on Wednesday, we will have another tutorial lesson where we play a little bit with platforms like OpenAI, Gym, or Unity, or this kind of things. So this will be a lighter lecture. Okay. And any questions, curiosities? Yeah, good. Then I will upload some references about multi-agent reinforcement learning, which will give you a clearer picture of the situation in the field. Okay, see you tomorrow.
Bye, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.